from judges and growing federal prison populations. This is from Professor Rachel Barkow, writing for the Harvard Law Review in 2019. Reagan and Congress created mandatory minimum sentences. In the 1990s, it continued to impose tough sanctions on recidivists, including a mandatory life sentence as part of 3 state laws. Congress also instituted harsh one-size-fits-all collateral consequences on individuals with felony convictions, particularly drug convictions. While Congress has passed modest reforms in recent years, the fundamental architecture put in place in the 1980s remains. Most of the laws are still on the books, and mandatory minimums continue to play an outsized role in filling federal prisons. More than half of the individuals in federal prisons as of late 2016 were convicted of an offense carrying a mandatory minimum sentence. Subpoint B. The status quo puts all decisions in the prosecutor's hands instead of the judge. Abigail McNellis, writing for George Mason University Civil Rights Law Journal in 2017. Mandatory minimums statutorily require judges to impose a specific sentence for certain criminal offenses. Mandatory minimums ignore individuality. Judges remain unable to consider qualities of each defendant. Considerations such as whether or not punishment is necessary, whether someone was injured, whether there is a possibility of rehabilitation, the individual's role in the crime, and motive for engaging in criminal activity all fall to the wayside when mandatory minimums deny judicial discretion. Power is directly given to prosecutors. Using mandatory minimums, prosecutors are able to pressure criminal defendants into pleading guilty to lower crimes, rather than invoking their constitutional right to a trial. Lower-level offenders often plead out or risk receiving daunting minimum sentences. The higher-ups in drug screens work with prosecutors to finagle their sentences down to lengths comparable to those intended for low-ranking drug offenders. Mandatory minimum laws have resulted in more than 3,000 nonviolent offenders receiving life without parole. Subpoint C. The First Step Act helped, but more needs to be done to reduce the harms of mandatory minimum sentences. The Sentencing Project in 2019. Continued bipartisan interest in criminal justice reform should advance these next steps in 2020. The opioid crisis has increased interest in DOJ and in Congress to expose more people to harsh mandatory minimum sentences for low-level cases. Congress should instead end mandatory minimums for drug offenses. The First Step Act has undoubtedly helped many people. However, it will not provide the systemic change necessary to undo the harm caused by the decades of mass incarceration at the federal level. Many people. However, it will not provide systemic change necessary to undo the harm caused by the decades of mass incarceration at the federal level, fueled by mandatory minimums. It is long overdue to take steps on the road to reform. It is because my partner and I agree with this last sentiment that the U.S. is long overdue to take the second step that we present the following plan. The United States federal government will ban the use of mandatory minimums used in sentencing of all federal crimes and allow for the changes to be retroactively applied to individual cases. Instead, judge discretion based upon all available evidence will be used to determine sentencing. Funding and enforcement are guaranteed, and we claim the right to clarify the intent of our plan. Advantage 1, reduce the private prison population. Subpoint A. Federal mandatory minimum penalties account for nearly half of the federal prison population. U.S. District Judge Mark Bennett in 2018. As of 2016, 72.3% of drug offenders in federal prisons were convicted of an offense carrying a mandatory minimum penalty, and more than half remain subject to penalty at sentencing. Black offenders in federal prisons were convicted of offenses carrying mandatory minimum penalties more frequently than any other race. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 was created mandatory minimum sentences based solely on drug quantity and type. The ADAA, even more than the guidelines, was responsible for the mushrooming number of federal prisoners and increased severity of their sentences. It takes only 5 grams of meth to trigger a 5-year minimum, yet it takes 100 grams of heroin to trigger the same mandatory minimum. Subpoint B. Mandatory sentences drive the expansion of federal private prisons. Wake Forest Journal of Law and Policy in 2016. Private prison company directors worked doggedly to create profits by drafting legislation and lobbying the passage of draconian sentencing policies, including mandatory minimums. Undeniable is the perverse and immoral incentives underlying the private prison industry translate into a demand for more prisons and prisoners. Mass incarceration is good business. The fact that the U.S. prison conditions are so dehumanizing and ghastly and so many prisoners are low-level, non-violent minor drug offenders begs the question of why we as a nation stand for private corporate profit in the realm of human imprisonment. Subpoint C. Private prisons are more violent and subject inmates to inhumane conditions. Same site as read before. Profit maximizing practices result in dangerous and uncontrollable prison environments. A study concluded that privately run prisons had assaulted rates 3 to 5 times higher than the public facilities. Beatings, rape, robbery, and riots are commonplace, and inmates are denied access to medication and care. Assaults on fellow inmates were 65% more frequent in for-profit/private prisons. Private prisons have significantly more escapes, homicides, assaults, and drug abuse compared to government-run prisons. One way for-profit prisons to minimize costs is by skimping on provisions, including food. Some prisoners live in filthy quarters without working lights or toilets. Conditions are traceable to demand upon private prisons to consistently operate at nearly maximum capacity. Subpoint D. Rhode Island eliminated 60% of new prisoners by ending mandatory minimums. The Sentencing Project in 2018. Rhode Island reduced the size of its prison population. Key changes in policy included a 59% decrease in new court admissions for drug crimes by eliminating mandatory minimum sentences for all drug crimes and changing possession of small amounts of marijuana to a civil infraction. Subpoint E. Since only 18% of federal prisoners are in private prisons, we can easily solve this advantage. Carl Takai, an attorney at the National Prison Project of the ACLU in 2017. 18% of federal prisoners are held in private prisons run by for-profit companies. Building private prison is associated with negative local job growth and depressed wages. Numerous rural towns went deeply into debt to finance new prisons, only to be left with unpaid bills and ruined bond ratings, and their prisoner contracts ended. Meanwhile, private prisons companies were able to pack up and leave town. Advantage 2.
Was that 8 minutes?
Yeah, that was 8 minutes.
Okay, let's cut off advantage 2. Hopefully that's not what Ryan was going to say. Okay.
I'm good. Are we doing cross-sects or?
Yes, I do want to show them cross-sects, but let me talk to them first, okay? So girls here, did you understand kind of why we space out the columns? You looked like you were doing it right. Okay. Online, hopefully you've got a column that kind of looks like this. So this is that advantage 1. Notice I didn't write down the E tag here, so that'd be something I'd ask about in cross-examination. When Ryan is going to attack, whatever he attacks, you put it next to what he attacks. So if he says, go to advantage 1, C, I'll have one response. You will write a 1 next to C and then what his tag is, okay? Now, cross-examination happens after each of the 8-minute speeches. Ryan, who's going to speak, would not normally do the cross-sects. His partner would. Ryan, during this time, would be preparing his speech. So we'll give him a little bit of extra time just in case he needs it to do that. Cross-examination is not flowed, meaning you don't write anything down here because technically one of the debaters isn't even paying attention to it. Anything that is valuable that you get out of cross-sects has to come into a speech later on, okay? But here's the priority. First, get any tags you're missing. Second of all, Ask any questions for understanding. If you don't know what a private prison is, you probably need to clarify, what's your definition of a private prison? If you understand everything and you flowed everything correctly, now you want to start setting up attacks or finding holes and weaknesses. For instance, their solvency evidence is Rhode Island. How do we know that's going to work everywhere? Could be a question that he asks. Riley?
So if you're just listening and you hear like an obvious gap, just run out on a post-it note or something, that always happens. Like just you and your partner can write notes to each other or any cross-like questions.
Correct. He's pointing out that you and your partner can whisper to each other, write notes to each other to help each other find mistakes in cross-ex, find holes, etc., that type of stuff. So we're all going to watch Ryan do the cross-ex. Milena doesn't necessarily know this case, so she'll do her best answering. So yeah. All right, as soon as you two are ready.
Oh yeah, I'm ready.
I'm good.
All right, let's start. So first off, in your contention one status quo, you state that you would put all of the decision in the judge's hands instead of the prosecutor's, correct?
Yeah, that's our B card.
Okay, why would the judge's discretion be any better than the prosecutor's?
So basically, prosecutors are a lot of times just looking to get a sentencing instead of actually finding the truth, because that is their job. So judges are more concerned with the truth than the prosecutors would be.
Okay, and would you say that judges have no bias in this regard?
I mean, obviously there's going to be some bias, but at the end of the day, the leaving it in the prosecutor's hands is net worse, as I've already explained.
Okay, let's move on to your advantage one. So do you solve for state prisons and crimes, or is this only at the federal level?
This is federal prison.
Okay, which then brings me into your subpoint D of advantage one, where you state that 18% of federal prisoners are in private prisons. So how do you claim that this impact is substantial when you can only solve for 18% of the prisoners in private prisons?
So it's talking about so like this advantage specifically is like at the end of the day, we're like still saving and like a net amount of people. I don't.
Okay. And then I mean, I don't have any more questions. I don't know if Lowry wants like all 3 minutes.
I don't know.
What is the site on your subpoint C for advantage one?
The site is the same one as the B card, so Wake Forest Journal of Law and Policy in 2016.
All right, that'll be all. Thank you.
All right, so he doesn't have to use up all of his time. You want to, because it's time for your partner to prep. So your partner will get really upset with you if you regularly don't use that time. But obviously for this, he doesn't need it really in any way, shape, or form, okay? He's going to do something involving what's called an off-case argument, ideally a disadvantage, and then he's going to attack one part of case. At the beginning, he'll do a roadmap. That roadmap tells you how to organize your paper. So if he says off case, that's a new sheet of paper that again, you start in that first column, okay? If he says advantage one first, your first sheet of paper would be advantage one, and he's cluing you into he's going to attack somewhere on advantage one, okay? Give me 1 second trying to help PF. All right, Xander, I'm not sure why it's doing that. It should work. Yeah. It's been viewed by me at least. All right, Ryan, you ready?
Yeah, I'm ready. All right. Let me know if anyone's not ready. But to begin with an off-time roadmap, I will be reading one off-case disadvantage, and then I will be attacking contention one, the status quo. With that said,
So I'm going to not throw it away permanently, but I'm going to put my plan and advantage one flow to the side. Got a blank sheet of paper, and then I've got my contention one there. Okay.
all right, with that said, then let's begin. The first off-case disadvantage is the fear of crime disadvantage. Subpoint A, uniqueness. The public's fear of crime is low now. From UD Ofer, Deputy National Political Director and Director of Campaign for Smart Justice, ACLU, August 14th, 2019. The reform-oriented prosecutors derided by Barr ran on sensible policies of using incarceration only as a last resort. Barr's speech before a conference room of police officers was not about public safety. It was about creating a climate of fear, where police officers are manning the ramparts between chaos and carnage on the one hand, and the civilized and tranquil society we all yearn for. And incarceration is the primary solution to all of society's problems. What scares Barr the most is that the politics of mass incarceration are beginning to change. Fear-mongering rhetoric no longer resonates with voters in the way that it did in the 80s and 90s. Americans have been influenced by movements like Black Lives Matter and understand the devastating impact that mass incarceration has had. Now, on to subpoint B, the link. The public still believes mandatory minimum sentences deters crime and keeps them safe. The public's opinion influences lawmakers, not the other way around. From Professor Luna, writing for the ASU Law in 2017. Influential opposition to mandatory minimums has come from government officials and political conservatives. Previous 4 presidents have all doubted the wisdom of law and mandatory sentences. Nonetheless, the reform or elimination of mandatory minimums may face long-standing political hurdles. Even during periods of low crime rates, the public has expressed fear of victimization and a belief that criminals were not receiving harsh enough punishment. Reform proposals have carried a career-ending risk for politicians who could be labeled soft on crime by allegedly providing the means for dangerous criminals to escape with lenient sentences. Subpoint C, internal link. Increased fear drives handgun purchases regardless of if that fear is justified. From Dr. Joseph Peer, UCLA Department of Psychiatry in 2019. Several models illustrate how emotions can hijack rational decision-making processes to the point of being the dominant influence on risk assessments. Perceived risk judgments are especially hampered by emotion. Fear can in particular overestimate risks. Most research comparing gun owners to non-gun owners suggested that ownership is rooted in fear. While long guns have historically been owned primarily for hunting, surveys have revealed the most frequent reason for handgun ownership is self-protection. The decision to obtain a firearm is largely motivated by fears of future victimization. And lastly, subpoint D, the impact. Gun sales increase household deaths. From Professor Strobe, Utrecht University in 2015. Guns are responsible for 32,000 gun-related deaths each year. Gun prevalence is positively related to homicide rates. There is no evidence for a protective effect of gun ownership, and it is associated with an increased risk of accidental death and suicide. Evidence on the effectiveness of gun control measures has not been encouraging because the gun lobby has successfully prevented the introduction of more effective measures. With that said, I will now be moving on to my opponent's case. First, I will be attacking the status quo. Against their subpoint B, I will have one response. My opponent stated that status quo puts power in hands of prosecutors, not judges. However, judicial departure from sentencing guidelines leads to racial inequality. From David Mustard, a professor of economics at the University of Georgia, February 2001. This paper examines 77,236 federal offenders and concludes Black males and offenders with low levels of education and income receive substantially longer sentences. Disparities are primarily generated by departures from the guidelines rather than differential sentencing within the guidelines. departures produce about 55% of the black-white difference. Black males are also less likely to get no prison term when that option is available, less likely to receive downward departures, and more likely to receive upward adjustments, and conditioned on having a downward departure, receive smaller reductions than whites. Thank you.
So that's a really good example. Hopefully that was flowable. You'll see on my contention 1 flow next to his B, I've got one response here, that it leads to racial inequality. Milena's job is now to first cross-ex. Normally she wouldn't, her partner would. Then she is going to give a speech defending her case. She can defend everything that Ryan said. She can also talk about the things that Ryan didn't talk about as well in giving her speech, okay? So here's the cross-examination. Once again, you don't flow. Ask me questions in the chat while this is happening or if you need them.
Oh wait, am I starting?
Yep.
Okay. Can you explain the warrants in on the disadvantage that when people's fear of crime increases, it causes them to purchase more handguns?
Yeah, so what the argument was talking about, that's our subpoint C, is it's stating that most handgun ownership is based off of fear. And so the reason why they bought their handgun in the first place was because of a fear of crime. So that's one warrant. And then the warrant that we had before that, which is subpoint B, the warrant in that states that if you pass the plan like your own and ban mandatory minimum sentences, then the public fear of crime will increase. So because the public fear of crime will increase, then as the subpoint C card states, the increase in handguns will also increase. The purchase of handguns will also increase.
Okay. So could there be other causes of buying handguns other than fear increases?
Potentially, but I don't know why that would matter, because this card is, and the impact is linear. So no matter what, your plan would cause an increase in handgun purchases, which would then be directly correlated with an increase in gun deaths.
Okay. And then can we move on to your attack on the contention 1? So can you just explain the warrants in your argument, how these judges depart from the sentencing guidelines?
So the card is stating that the reason why there's racial inequality with sentencing is not because of mandatory minimums. It's because of what the judges decide is going to happen. So essentially, it's stating that judges ignore sentence guidelines and they give out differential sentencing between races, and that's where the inequality comes from. So essentially, by removing mandatory minimums, racial inequality is going to increase because you're giving more power to the judges, which are already racially biased.
Okay, I don't have any more questions.
All right, Milena's going to take a little bit of time to prepare her 2AC. This is not her normal case, so she doesn't have a backup for it in any way, shape, or form. She might pull a card from the internet or so, but logic always works in debate. And so she can do this. Now, on disadvantages, I like it when they literally attack each level, the uniqueness, the link, the internal link, the impact. The vast majority of debaters will group it. I kind of do a half moon here to signify it's all been grouped and lumped together as one argument. They will then just put their arguments straight down. 2, 3, 4, 5 arguments, just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I prefer if they're like, let's look at the link, I'll have one response. Very few people do that anymore. That's old school. So if she says like group, or if she just says, let's look at the DA, I'll have 5 responses. You just put 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with numbers next to it. Okay. Online people, again, if you got questions, flash them my way. So I want you guys up and debating multiple times next week. So the onus now is on me on getting the files out to you. Like I've made the decision. I don't have time to teach you to get your own files. So I'm now making them. So for instance, there's 4 AF areas. The case that Melena's reading is the 3rd AF case being released. I made that today in an hour. Got to make one more. That'll take me probably 30 minutes because I'll do it without distractions. And it's a pretty easy one, drug decriminalization. Then you guys are going to have to pick which case. You two are debating together, right? Okay. Elias, Braden believes you're his partner. Let me know if that's not correct. Everybody else in here has one. Excellent. Well, you get to choose between all 4 of them. I just haven't released one of them. So you can do the immigration case about sanctuary cities. You can do the one on facial recognition that I put on Slack either this morning or yesterday. I'll put the mandatory minimums up as soon as I get control of my computer back again. And then I've got to make the drug decriminalization one. It's my hope tonight, if I have the ability time-wise to do it, to actually put together short, like, explanation podcast style stuff of each case where I kind of talk you through the benefits of the case, pitfalls, etc. We'll plan on you literally running this case at the first couple of tournaments. By then, there should be enough of a breathing space where you can change the case however you want. Okay, like maybe you don't like this advantage, you want to change things. However, at the beginning, I'm just going to say, just run this case just because of time. Now, you'll still have to edit it down. So for instance, I have a whole nother advantage in here. And Milena was reading at an awesome novice speed for not having the case beforehand, pretty good in fluencies, like pretty good fluency. She didn't have too many mistakes. And she still couldn't get the second advantage in. So it's way too long. My internal clock is wrong in the pandemic right now. Everything's like too short. Or just re-highlight it to where you're spending less time on everything, or take a piece of evidence out, etc., that type of stuff.
So, like, what would we do if we come, like, after school? Like, would we argue working on the arguments that we're going to do?
So the question here is, what do I do after school? There's a couple of things. Number one, you can do an individual work session with me or any varsity member where I just sit here and answer your questions. I become your, lack of a better word, like slave. Like, what do you need help with? You know, and then I'm at your service. Genie is a better word than slave. Let's go with genie. Okay. You could ignore me and just find a space here to work alone or with your partner, just using our Wi-Fi, our space, that type of stuff. And if somebody's around and you got a quick question, you can. Next week, I plan on organizing after-school online debates, judged by varsity, that type of stuff. But it's really up to you what you want to do after school. The nice thing is just other teammates are around to help you.
For now, we're done with it, try to find someone to help you, whether it's one of us or Lowry or something. Like, I started working at the school once we got a few tournaments in, I knew how to, like, answer stuff myself. I just had to start finding
Milena, you close?
I cannot find any answers to the fear of crime, Desad.
Just run some logic arguments that gun ownership good. You've got those in your pocket, I believe. And also attack the uniqueness fear of crime low. Like, that's pre-Black Lives Matter, George Floyd. What do you think's happened to fear, particularly among Americans, of African-American BLM supporters?
Got it.
No. So the question here is, do I need a new sheet of paper? Highly unlikely at this point. Okay. You only do a new sheet of paper if it's a brand new, like off-case argument. The AF won't do that. Neg occasionally will after this point.
So is she just going to like shoot down this?
So a basic level debater will just respond to whatever Ryan said. I call that chasing. So 9 out of 10 early debaters will just say, I'm going to talk about the fear of crime, DA, and then I'm going to talk about contention 1. And then they'll ignore the rest. A really good debater, okay, will actually focus a lot on what wasn't said. So they'll avoid chasing and talk instead about what Ryan missed, in addition to defending their case.
Is this one 5 minutes typically?
No, we're still, so technically this is not Milena giving it, this is Veltri, this is her partner. It would be her partner's first 8-minute speech. Ryan didn't use up all 8 minutes, which again in novice debate oftentimes will be the case. I didn't want him to like go crazy. Like varsity will read 2 or 3 disadvantages and attack multiple parts on case.
Right now, are you just wanting them to do like chasing type of thing? Since you don't really know?
9 out of 10 will do it. If you can avoid that and just concentrate on, like, if you're flowing correctly, you can see here that A and C clearly weren't attacked. So when you go here in this third column to defend B, you might as well mention to the judge, I just want you to note that A was not attacked. Please extend that. Note that C was not attacked. Please extend it. They have not responded to it. Even better, then you can say, here's why that's important that they ignored it. Okay, here's why it's significant.
You want to at least extend pretty much everything when they drop this, because I mean, we had a couple at the beginning of last year. We faced Josh and John, one of our novices at the first minute, and we dropped everything that wasn't attacked, and then it's just a bad debate. So,
Yeah. The goal generally is for at least somebody to say extend all that's not dropped. The advanced technique is to tell you why those drops matter. Okay. Like the other day I dropped a pen. That doesn't matter. I picked it up and it was fine. I almost in second block dropped my brand new Mac. I actually flew out and popped it up and then caught it again. That would have mattered a lot. Like dropping the Mac that's brand new and like thousands of dollars is much bigger difference than dropping a pen. Dropping an argument isn't necessarily bad or wrong in debate or causes you to lose. Dropping certain arguments can cause you to lose, though.
So basically, like when they're saying like why they didn't do it, it's like defend like what, like basically like kind of restate what you said, but also like extend on it.
Correct. And the more you're familiar with your arguments, the more you'll naturally know what's important and what to extend. So the further you go, the more rounds you do, you'll start narrowing in on this is important and this is not.
Okay, so when we actually debate, are we using the briefs and files that like you made, or are we making our own like kind of similar?
You will eventually make your own to add to what I'm going to give you. Because of time, that's the better way to do it. Because of time, not only am I going to make AFs, I'm also going to compile some neg ones for you. That will for sure be given to you by Monday of next week.
Okay.
The neg takes a little bit longer.
I'm good.
Yeah, so I'm going to hand you enough stuff to give yourself a chance in a round. Okay. All right. Milena's ready. So she's going to tell us the order to arrange our sheets of paper. Ryan, we're probably not going to do another speech after this. Okay.
So the order is going to be contention 1, then it's going to be advantage 1, and then it's going to be the fear of crime disad. So is everybody ready? Okay, let's begin on our contention 1, the status quo. First, I would like you to note that our subpoint A, that mandatory minimums continue harsh punishments, was dropped, and I would like you to extend this. Secondly, moving on to our contention B, my opponent had one response, which was that judicial partner departure from sentencing guidelines leads to racial injustice. However, first of all, I'd like you to extend the card that it is saying that it is net better that that judges make these decisions instead of prosecutors who are just trying to get out a sentence. And secondly, I'm going to read evidence from FAM 2020 saying that repealing mandatory minimums is the solution and will lead to fairer sentences. One way to reform mandatory minimum sentences is to simply get rid of them, to strike them out of the federal code or repeal them. Without mandatory minimums, federal judges would still have to do what they do in all federal criminal cases, which is apply the federal sentencing guidelines. Guidelines also provide greater flexibility to take all the facts into consideration and impose a sentence that fits. Secondly, I'd like you to listen to specifically the internals of this card, which directly proves my opponent's argument invalid in the sense that he said that the judges would no longer reform to sentencing guidelines. However, this card directly contradicts that. And you can also include that with our first card that we read. I would also like you to extend our subpoint C that the First Step Act did not go far enough and more must be done. This was dropped, so they cannot bring it up again, and I would like you to extend it. Now, moving on to our Advantage 1, which went completely dropped by my opponent. So the main thesis of this was that right now, federal mandatory minimum penalties are causing a large amount of people to be in the federal prison population. And so this is causing even more private prisons to be created. Now, private prisons are net bad because the way that these prisoners are treated in these prisons is inhumane. They are subject to violent conditions. If you look at the internals of our card from the Wake Forest Journal of Law Policy, this was our C card, it specifically mentions that there are far more beatings, rapes, robberies, and riots in these private prisons than in and as more are being created because of these mandatory minimum sentences. So if we were to pass the plan to end these mandatory minimum sentences, we can see that there would be less private prisons formed, which means that there would be less beatings, rapes, robberies, and riots of these prisoners. And furthermore, our solvency was also dropped in this advantage that Rhode Island eliminated their mandatory minimums, and this caused they eliminated up to 60% of their new prisoners. This is significant because it proves that ending mandatory minimums works. And so this is our solvency, which has gone untouched. So you can flow solvency, or that our plan solves the problems we have intended to solve to the affirmative team. So next, I'm going to be moving on to the fear of crime disadvantage. For our subpoint A, for his subpoint A, he said that the uniqueness was that fear of crime is low now. However, this evidence comes from a world pre-George Floyd in the mass Black Lives Matter protests. People right now are more scared than ever are more scared of crime than ever, as African Americans are afraid to go on the street because of police violence, and there's riots happening across the country. So if there was any time that people are going to be buying handguns, it was now. So before the act is passed. So if the act were passed, this means that there wouldn't be a lot of change in handgun sales because a lot of people are already buying them. And secondly, and so in response to their link, he says that mandatory minimums make it safer. However, this is not true. Mandatory minimums do not make us safer. Rhode Island proves. Lauren Bricken-Eisen, director of the Brennan Center's Justice Program, June 9, 2015. There's compelling evidence that mandatory minimums do not make us safer. Rhode Island repealed all mandatory minimum sentencing laws for drug offenses. Rhode Island's prison population decreased, but more importantly, its violent crime rate decreased as well. There is little to no evidence that longer prison terms for many decrease, but for many nonviolent offenders make us safer. Indeed, it has made the precise opposite effect. Prison can cause inmates to commit more crimes upon release, partly because of low-level offenders find themselves surrounded by more serious and violent offenders in prison, and partly because they have trouble finding employment and reintegrating into society upon release. Additionally, on his subpoint C, I would like to extend my argument about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, that people are already scared and buying handguns, so this is not going to have a great effect. And so, on their subpoint D, saying that gun ownership will increase household deaths, a lot of people who are going to be buying handguns are not the ones that can't handle it, but the ones that buy them anyways. So, and also I'd like you to extend the Black Lives Matter argument that I've made throughout this diss ad. So therefore you can see that the amount of handguns that are actually going to be purchased isn't going to increase that much at all. And so mandatory minimums is still a net good, because we are preventing the inhumane treatment of these prisoners in these private prisons, which has been dropped by my opponents. Therefore, I can only see an affirmative ballot.